there is a curve most people never see. A slow bend in the soul where love, pain, and forgiveness all meet and disappear into one another. It begins, as most things do, with the wound. A moment. A word. A betrayal, sometimes small, sometimes sharp enough to slice through the years. Men remember these wounds differently. They do not always speak of them. They carry them in silence, like smooth stones in their pockets, touching them when no one is watching. And over time, those stones grow heavier. Not because the wound deepens, but because the memory does. The mind replays it, reshapes it, polishes it until it gleams with quiet resentment. Pause, sound of rain outside, gentle, rhythmic. Forgiveness, they say, is freedom. But for many men, forgiveness feels like loss. It feels like letting go of the one thing that proves it mattered, the pain itself. To forgive is to release not only the other, but also the story that justified your suffering. And that, for a man who has built his life upon endurance, feels like betrayal. Because we are taught, from boyhood, to hold on. Hold the line. Hold your ground. Hold your anger, your pride, your grief. To let go feels weak. To soften feels wrong. But here's the quiet truth that time eventually reveals. Holding on does not keep you strong. It keeps you from moving. The older a man grows, the more he sees how little strength there is in resistance. He learns, slowly, painfully, that forgiveness is not for the one who hurt him. It is for the one who has carried that hurt too long. Pause, long exhale, flicker of firelight. Still, forgiveness doesn't arrive as peace. It arrives as grief. It feels like death, the death of what you once clung to, the death of the story that defined you. When you finally whisper, "I forgive you," a part of you whispers goodbye to the version of yourself that needed that pain to feel whole. And that is why it feels like loss. Because it is. You lose the justification for your anger. You lose the familiar rhythm of resentment. You lose the image of yourself as the one who was wronged. What remains is emptiness. And in that emptiness, most men feel naked. They ask, if I am not the man who suffered, who am I? Who am I without my grievance, without my story? It takes years, sometimes decades, to realize that this emptiness is not the absence of self, but the space where the true self can finally breathe. Pause, the sound of a single log shifting in the fire. Forgiveness is not about the past. It's about creating enough silence within to let something new be born. But to a man who has lived too long inside his armor, silence feels dangerous. It feels like surrender. And so he hesitates. He tells himself that forgiveness is unnecessary. That time will heal it, that distance is enough. But time does not forgive. It only buries. And what is buried, always returns. One day, perhaps years later, you hear a song, or see a face, or pass by a place. And the memory surfaces again. Not to torment you, but to remind you, you have not yet let go. It waits patiently, like an old letter you've never opened. Waiting for the courage to read what's inside, and finally release it to the fire. Pause. Forgiveness feels like loss because, in a way, it is the last act of love. Not for the one who hurt you, but for the life you've lived inside that pain. It is a burial. A sacred one. You bury the part of yourself that stayed frozen in the moment of hurt. And in that burial, you begin, quietly, tremblingly, to return to life. Fire crackles, rain softens. There is no celebration in it. No light or trumpet of triumph. Only a man sitting by himself, staring at the fire, whispering words no one will ever hear. I forgive you. And somewhere deeper still, I forgive me. That is where forgiveness begins. Not as victory, but as a small, private death that allows something pure to be born in the ashes. There is something sacred in the anger men carry. Not the kind that burns wildly and harms, but the kind that smolders quietly, like embers beneath ash, warm enough to keep the heart from freezing, but never bright enough to heal. That anger, becomes a companion. A familiar voice that whispers, "You were right. You were wronged. Don't forget." And in a strange way, men find safety in it. Because as long as they are angry, they don't have to feel helpless. They don't have to feel small. Pause, the soft rhythm of rain fills the silence. Forgiveness asks for something men are rarely taught to give. Their pride. And pride, for many, is the last defense against the unbearable truth. That they have been hurt more deeply than they ever admitted. To forgive is to look directly into that hurt. To stand unguarded before it. And to stop fighting. That is why forgiveness feels like loss. Because it demands the surrender of a shield that has protected you for years. When a man begins to forgive, he feels it first not as peace, but as emptiness. The anger that once defined him begins to dissolve. And for a moment, there is nothing to take its place. It is a terrifying silence. Like standing in a room after the music has stopped. Realizing that the echo was the only thing keeping you company. Pause, the fire pops, a slow, steady crackle. Many men, when they reach this point, retreat. They go back to their anger, because it feels safer than absence. They tell themselves, "I am not ready to forgive." And maybe they aren't. Forgiveness cannot be forced. It grows only in the soil of readiness. When the pain has exhausted its story. When the anger has burned itself into ash. But here is what few understand. Forgiveness is not an act of mercy toward the other. It is an act of mercy toward the self. Because the longer a man carries his rage, the more it shapes the contours of his soul. His smile becomes thinner. His laughter quieter. His eyes harder. He begins to mistake endurance for strength. He begins to believe that holding pain makes him noble. And the tragedy is, he forgets what softness feels like. Pause, the sound of distant thunder, low and slow. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering differently. It is seeing the story not as a wound, but as a chapter that shaped you. One that no longer needs to define you. To forgive is to look at what happened. And whisper, "It was real. It hurt. But it is over." And yet, for many men, that whisper feels like death. Because for years, the wound gave them meaning. It gave them purpose, even if through suffering. When they let go, the question returns. What remains of me now? The fire shifts, quiet breath of wind through the rain. That question is not a curse. It is an opening. In the silence after anger, you begin to hear your own voice again. A voice softer, slower, more human. It says, "You are not what happened to you. You are not the betrayal, nor the regret. You are what remains when all of it is gone." Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a slow unfolding. Like winter thawing into spring. There is a day when you realize that the memory no longer hurts as it once did. It still lives in you. But without teeth. You can touch it. And it no longer bites. Pause, faint rain, constant, meditative. But before that peace, there is always a quiet mourning. You grieve the anger. You grieve the version of yourself who needed it. You grieve the years lost to silence and pride. And in that grief, you grow lighter. Because forgiveness does not erase the past. It loosens its grip. One day, the man who once swore he'd never forgive finds himself staring out a window in the rain. Feeling something shift inside, quietly, almost invisibly. He does not say the words aloud. He does not even decide it. But somewhere, deep within the folds of his being, something unclenches. And that is how forgiveness arrives. Not as a choice, but as a sigh. A letting go that happens when the soul is simply too tired to carry the past any longer. Fire softens, rain becomes steady, rhythmic. Forgiveness feels like loss, yes. Because it is the loss of illusion. The illusion that justice will heal you. The illusion that pain will keep you safe. The illusion that you can rewrite what already happened by holding on to it. In the end, a man learns. He cannot rewrite the story. He can only choose how it ends. And the ending, always, is silence. The silence of acceptance. The silence of release. Not triumph. Not victory. Just stillness. Pause, deep breath, long and calm. Forgiveness is not the end of the wound. It is the beginning of healing. And healing, for a man, often looks like loss. Because for the first time, he stands without his armor. And in that stillness, in that unbearable quiet, he begins to hear something faint, fragile, and true. His own heart. Beating, softly, still here. There comes a moment when you realize you are no longer waiting for an apology. No longer waiting for understanding, or closure, or balance. You simply sit there, with yourself. And you understand that what you wanted all along was not to be proven right, but to be free. Forgiveness changes shape with age. When you are young, you imagine it as a grand act. Something holy, something noble. But as the years pass, you begin to see it's less about others and more about the quiet space inside you that no one else can reach. It's about making peace with the echo. Because even after forgiveness, the echo remains, faint, but real. And it reminds you, you once loved, you once trusted, you once lost. But now, you are here. Alive. Still capable of warmth. Still capable of seeing beauty in the smallest things. A flicker of firelight. The smell of rain on the wooden window frame. Men rarely talk about this kind of peace. Because it doesn't look strong. It doesn't look victorious. It looks like sitting alone. Hands folded. Heart unclenched. But there is something deeply sacred about that stillness. Because for the first time in a long time, you are not performing. You are not defending. You are not waiting for someone to understand you. You are simply being. And in that being, you discover something strange. You no longer need to forgive anyone else. Because the one who hurt you is gone. Not from the world, but from the place inside you where they once lived. And in their absence, you finally have space to return home. Home, not as a place, but as a state of soul. A quiet room where no voices argue. Where the only sound is the soft hum of your own existence. Forgiveness feels like loss for men. Because it strips away everything the world told them to be. Strong. Unshaken. In control. But when all those layers fall, what remains is something the world forgot to value. Gentleness. And gentleness is not weakness. It is the power to stay soft in a world that taught you to harden. There is an old saying that when a man forgives, the gods lower their voices to listen. Because they know it is not an act of mercy, it is an act of courage. To forgive is to walk into emptiness. To meet yourself there. And not turn away. You will lose people. You will lose versions of yourself. You will lose the stories that kept you alive. And that is okay. Because what comes after loss is not nothingness, but clarity. The kind that does not shout. The kind that breathes. Forgiveness does not promise joy. It promises truth. And truth is often quiet. And a little lonely. And yet, utterly alive. One day, you will look back. And realize that the pain you carried so long was never meant to be a punishment. It was simply the sound of your soul learning to speak again. And maybe forgiveness was the only language it had left. There is no final line in this story. No closure. No applause. Just you. And the fire. And the rain. And somewhere between them, a man who finally stopped searching for the right words and began to listen to the silence instead. And in that silence, you will understand That forgiveness was never about letting go of others. It was about returning to the quiet truth of who you are.